Welcome to the Sacramentalists, a podcast where the ancient Christian faith is brought to bear on issues prevalent in modern culture. We're your hosts. I'm Father Wesley Walker.
I'm Father Creighton McElveen.
I'm Father Hayden Butler.
Well, guys, it's good to see with you and be with you. I know we've released one episode already this season, but because of a move that my family and I had, I was unable to participate. So this is the first time the three of us have been able to sit down together. So I hope that your 2025 is off to a good start.
Gang's all here. I mean, I'm I had a less than desirable week. I texted you guys about this, but I injured myself and had to spend a night in the ER earlier in the week. So not an ideal start to the year, but I'm hoping that I'm getting it done now and the rest of the year is just great. I'm gonna
get it out of the way.
Front load the weird, get sick, get injured, do all that kind of stuff so that, the rest of the year is smooth sailing.
Yeah. I saw this meme the other day. It was like looking like 2025 is going to be, I'm on the Lord's strongest soldiers list for the 6th year in a row. He goes, I thought I signed up for the wealth and prosperity package, but I guess I was wrong.
Yeah. Oh, that's terrible. Well, we had, as Father Hayden mentioned in the last episode, we had plumbing problems in our house when we first moved in. So we moved in 2 weeks ago, and the drain behind the washing machine overflowed into my office, which is where I'm sitting now, where all my boxes of books are. And so boxes got, soaked, and it was just terrible. It happened twice. Because they snaked the line, thought they fixed it, but really it was tree roots in the pipes, and so they had to send someone else out later. Fortunately, as of 2 days ago, it's taken care of. We can use, but for a week we weren't even able to take a shower, use the dishwasher. We weren't supposed to flush toilet paper, so it was pretty terrible. So these boxes behind me are book boxes, not alcohol boxes. But one would understand, if I needed those to be alcohol boxes in such a situation.
After the plumbing, yeah,
That's right.
When we came home with our son from the hospital after he was born, the moment we got home, we walked in to find that water was coming up from under the floorboards, and we're like, uh-oh, it was a pinhole leak in the laundry room as well, and so we're just like, okay, time to go into action here. We just had a child born 36 hours ago, but we can do this too. It's the worst timing ever.
That is terrible. That's like on The Office when Jim goes home after they have the baby, and Dwight's deconstructed the whole kitchen. Except this is real life and way worse.
Way real life, yeah. That's right.
Well, when I hurt myself, I hurt my foot. It was like midnight.
Oh no.
And so my mind was like, don't do anything that wakes the baby up. Like whatever you have to suffer through, you just keep the baby asleep.
Right. Yeah.
And so, it's like a murder scene in our bedroom. There's blood everywhere. And I'm just holding it all in. I will not
fighting down on a belt,
Yes. It was like the only thing that matters is sleep.
That's right.
And he slept through all of it. Thankfully, my mother was able to come over and help us out, watch him while we went to the ER. Which very thankful for. But he stayed asleep, unfazed by the night of trauma. And the next morning he was like, hey guys, what a great night of sleep. We had a great night last night. What about you?
Jeez. Kids these days,
That's right. Too many violent video games.
Well, I'm sorry to hear you lost your toe. Fortunately, that doesn't affect your ability to offer the sacrifice of the Mass. That would only be if you lost a finger.
I didn't lose my toe, listeners, but there are stitches involved. So,
if you would like to donate to Father Creighton's missing toe fund, we'll make a way for that to happen.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. All right. Well, perhaps we should get into the reason people are listening, which is not to hear us shoot the breeze about random events that have happened in our lives, but rather to talk about masculinity and the church, which, of course, everybody is, talking about these days. And I to preface this, I'd say, one of the interesting facets of priestly life is that you get to have sort of ongoing conversations with parishioners over months, weeks, years, even sometimes. And sometimes those are innocuous and surface level conversations, like how terrible the Dallas Cowboys are playing. I get reminded of that almost every week at my church. But some people really want to kind of bypass the trivial. And sometimes they want to bypass the theological, and they want to talk to you about a political agenda that they proffer, or, some sort of cultural thing that they think is very important. And of course, the church should be a place where one can explore ideas. But I think in my parish recently, there's been someone that I've been having sort of an ongoing conversation with about masculinity. And this has been an ongoing, it's been a couple of years that we've been kind of talking about this. And in some circles, there is a sense of profound disappointment in the church, I think, over how the church has treated masculinity. And I think some of it's warranted in some ways, some of it's not warranted. But I want to share with the listeners a video that my parishioner sent me that kind of got this conversation started. And it's from an Instagram fitness influencer who's talking about masculinity in the church. And so we're going to play this video. So if you're listening to this, you'll hear it. If you're watching it, I think you'll be able to see the video. And then we're going to kind of use that as a springboard into this conversation about masculinity and the church. So here we go.
From your point of view, how can the Christian church mentor young right-wing men? So there's a lot of things wrong with the generic Christian church in the United States, and that's not criticism of Christianity, it's criticism of churchianity. The United States evangelical movement has created a very watered-down, generic, defanged version of Christianity. People, they go to the mega churches, they sing songs about feeling Jesus deep inside them, which sounds gay. And the way that men are instructed to behave is they are inferior to their wives because their wives are closer to God. And the Bible, parts of it you don't actually have to follow, like being obedient to your husband. And the preachers, the pastors present themselves as, I'm a poor fallen man, I'm so lucky that my wife chose a broken soul like me. It's all emasculated. So the men are emasculated. The church leaders are emasculated. They're weak men. The version of Christianity they put forth, it doesn't bring any concrete form or definition to the world. It makes for very naive people where everyone's to be accepted, and Christians are notorious for getting grifted by anyone who claims they're saved by Jesus. And so, why is the church losing power? That's why. Men, if you want to attract men to a movement, you have to project an image of strength, of power, of having an effect in the world. You have to present an actionable philosophy. The evangelical view that you don't really care about society around you because we're all going to go to heaven anyway, so worry about the world that comes next. Okay, well now you're divesting yourself of the world around you, and you're not playing any active role in it, and then you're upset when it beats you up. So there's a lot of things that need to be worked on. Another thing to add, and the reason I have some passion about this topic is I went to church a lot when I was younger in high school, even in college. I'm not Christian, but I did enjoy going to church. Why are women preaching in the church? Why is the pastor's wife coming up and giving a sermon? None of that's biblical. The church leaders should be men. If you want women within the structure of the church, they can have their own women's group. They're not ministers, they're not pastors, they're not preachers, they're not any of those things at all. They're not. If you have a problem with that, go join a Unitarian church, which has no real beliefs about anything. But making that change would be necessary, amongst many others. But that one always stood out to me. I was always perplexed by that, since I know for a fact there's nothing in the Bible, Old and New Testament, that says go listen to girls at church. On that note, the Catholics and the Orthodox Church, they got it right. So if you guys are searching for God and you're looking for a church, that'd be my recommendation.
Okay. There's a lot going on there.
Mm-hmm.
Some much more wrong than others, we should say, I guess. So I thought we could use that as a springboard. I guess one other resource that we could look at is real quick, just as a way of entry into the conversation, is an article that was published in the New York Post, I guess back in December, early December. Young men leaving traditional churches for masculine Orthodox Christianity in droves. And the article is about a young man named Ben Christensen, who was an Anglican. I believe he went to the big Falls Church Anglican, I think. And he ended up leaving and joining the Orthodox Church because he felt like there was a profound sense of masculinity there, and found that very attractive. The article cites the teaching of Josiah Trenum, who's an Orthodox sort of online influencer, and he emphasizes sort of how Orthodoxy is so masculine, as a kind of way that they're bringing people in to the church. So with all that, I think it's, I think we need to at least listen to critiques that are being offered, and there may be ways in which we can learn from them, but also there may be ways in which, as the church, we would want to provide some sort of rejoinder to them as well. Maybe the critiques are made from unbalanced views of masculinity and femininity. Maybe they're made from places that actually aren't very solid in terms of metaphysics. And so we want to engage and also offer a sort of counter critique, I think, in ways that would be helpful to the average Christian person. So I think that a lot of the complaints that are offered in a video like that, or in an article like the one from the New York Post, which we'll try to link to in the comments as well, he's right that evangelical worship can at times feel touchy-feely, emotion. It's too emotional. So Father Creighton, you're not a convert, but Father Hayden and I are converts. And being raised in evangelical circles, there was certainly a kind of emotionalism at Liberty University when we had chapel services weekly that we had to attend. The same people would sort of always have their hands up, eyes closed, verge of tears, 3 times a week, every week for a whole semester. And the messaging sort of being, if you're not reacting this way, then something's wrong. You need to really, see what's wrong with you, that you wouldn't be brought to this emotional place. That is not a great understanding of worship. But I also am not convinced that really is gendered either. I don't think that kind of worship, that sort of emotionalism, is not necessarily inherently feminine or masculine. I think that's just a tendency among some human beings. Agree with that or disagree?
I think you're bringing something important to the forefront here, is that that there's an image, right, that's created and then circulated and then in some ways enforced as to what this what a thing is supposed to look like. One of the experiential kind of anecdotes from being in more kind of emotionally driven devotional settings and church settings is there was a kind of a pressure for things needed to feel a certain way at a certain time, and also it tended to look askance at being too intellectual or being too rational, as and looking at that as a kind of coldness toward God or a hardness of heart toward neighbor. And I think what begins as an attempt to maybe make up for in a different time, a previous time, maybe a kind of cold, indifferent, latitudinarian Christianity. You can start building at something, and then it gains its own momentum that then produces maybe its opposite in a kind of a more romanticized, expression of the faith. I think the problem is that it's way easier to just continuously pendulum swing between these sort of extremes, than to, do what I think the Orthodox do, the Catholics do, and I would say is actually, right there at the bedrock of Anglican practice as well, which is to hold to hold these things together, to possess them to the nth degree. Martin Thornton, for example, captures this well in English Spirituality when he talks about Anglican spirituality as characterized by the speculative affective synthesis, right? That holds together the wonderful, powerful, devotional, even, at times quasi-erotic, poetry of the Christian tradition with, its commitment to an unflinching rigor of thought. And also, we also should add to that the integrity of, the soul and body, and we should add into that, the integrity of a whole person within their communities, and it's holding all things together. It's one of the senses that feeds into this idea of Catholicity, is that it's accounting for the whole, right? It's not a mystery religion that, bids you over into one part of yourself or one sort of, narrow niche of the world. And that's really what we're getting at here with that. I think with this, one of the things we're getting at with this masculinity debate that's going on, and also with a femininity debate that's going along adjacent to it, is it's way too easy, and it's very easy to market a version of the thing that is, again, narrowly addressed to a particular personality type, because then you can create a brand, and then you can sell that brand, and then it kind of becomes a racket. But unfortunately, rackets can become, reverse engineered as to be the form of the thing, right? The thing we should all aspire to, but maybe it was never meant to be.
Yeah, I think it's not that, like, the reason I became Anglican wasn't because I didn't feel comfortable as a man in evangelical spaces where there was, praise and worship music. It's that those praise and worship songs are stylistically and substantively bad. Like, I'm sorry, I don't want to listen to a hipster in skinny jeans singing "You're the Same God" over and over and over and over again. But it's not because I'm a man. It's just because I don't think anybody should have to be subjected to that per the Geneva Convention's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment.
Yeah.
Now, I also think our doubting lunkhead is right, that Christian leaders do sometimes emphasize fallenness, especially in Protestant circles, rather than the fact that grace divinizes us. And so there are parts of the church where that's all you're ever going to hear. And you're never really going to grow any more than just, I'm a sinner who needs to be saved by grace. And that's certainly true. It's a large part of the gospel, but grace doesn't leave you as it finds you. There should be an emphasis on transformation, on progress in the Christian life. And so you do find that lacking. And so there is sometimes a lack of substance. And I think as a new Christian, that can be frustrating because, you look at the rates of turnover in a mega church and you do see that there's a lot. They bring a lot of people in, but they don't stay for more than a few years. You reach a certain point where, okay, I'm hearing the same sermon every however many, and so, yeah, you're not going to grow. You've heard it all before. So yeah, maybe you leave and you go somewhere else, or you just stop going to church at all. And so, yeah, I think those are some of the things he says that are true, but I would like to, I'd like to challenge some of the presuppositions that he makes. I think the first one, and this is more of a surface level one, and Father, you've already kind of gotten on this, is that using feminine imagery inherently disconnects from male listeners or participants.
Right.
It is certainly true that in gender, and especially in relationships, there is a sort of sacramental window into how God relates to us. And so a husband's not a wife and a wife's not a husband, because the two of them coming together show us something of the mystery of God's relationship to the church. But in relationship to God, we are the bride, and the scriptures are very clear on this imagery, that you are the bride of Christ, speaking to a mixed audience of men and women. Act as the bride, because in relation to God, we're receptive. Now, I think it's interesting that I got this video sent to me, and then a couple days later, we hosted Dr. Grace Heyman, who wrote the book Jesus Through Medieval Eyes, at our church for an event. through a local organization called the Eliot Society. And her whole talk was about medieval artistic and poetic descriptions of Jesus as our lover, of Jesus as the bridegroom, which has a biblical and not a cultural origin.
Right.
And so Jesus is as the bridegroom. I mean, Song of Solomon, is a robust book that many Christians have engaged with, seeing themselves as the bride and Christ as the groom in the book. I mean, the patristics quickly adapted an allegorical reading of that love poem, where they read the male lover to be Christ, the female lover to be the church, but also each human soul individually. And so I think that imagery fermented in the collective Christian mind. So you look at the patristic era, you look at people like Origen and Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory the Great, Ambrose, Jerome. And by the time you get to the medieval period, it's a pretty common aspect of the Christian imagination. Dr. Heyman pointed out Bernard of Clairvaux preached 86 sermons on the Canticle of Canticles, and he wasn't even done when he died. There were more to come. So it's not just and I should say, it's not just the imagery of repressed monastics. Another video that's been making the rounds, Father Hayden mentioned this before we were started, is Mark Driscoll talking about how Jesus was a celibate, or how Catholic priests are celibate virgins who, are going to die in poverty, and how he doesn't want to be like that. So one could say, well, maybe that's just the monastics who have this kind of weird reading of Song of Songs because they're all repressed. But no, there are a number of medieval devotional aids for men and women that include these imageries of Christ and the church, or Christ and the soul as lovers, that culminate with Christ and the soul sharing a marriage bed together. So it's not a cultural, or it's not unique to our culture to depict the church in feminine ways. In fact, this is part of the DNA of the church, to understand itself as feminine. Yeah. So far, so good?
Yeah, I think, a few years back, I wrote an article for Earth and Altar called "The Marian Shape of the Church," where I got into some of these different aspects. And the important thing, I think, when we look at the church's continuous devotion to Our Lady, it transcends the sort of cultural categories of masculinity and femininity, right? So you could go back 200 years and find Christians who today people would say were quote unquote masculine and strong and burly, muscular Christians, having this sort of devout relationship and veneration for the Blessed Virgin Mary, for seeing her as embodying the church as a whole, her receptivity, her openness, her saying yes to God, the lover-beloved dynamic that you were talking about, Father Wes, like that train of thought goes all the way back to the beginning. So it's not like the church is suddenly in the last X amount of years, oh, well, whoops, we flipped definitions for what masculine and feminine are, and we're having this massive struggle with how we understand masculinity and femininity because of, this, whatever the given cultural context is. If you have a problem with ideas of receptivity, ideas of lover and beloved, and the soul relating to God, and the consummation of that relationship in the wedding feast, even sort of Eucharistic allegories, the way we view coming into communion with Christ through that sacrament, without trying to be crass, we can understand in sexual language. We can understand in full communion, consummation. Those are terms that we use for married couples. And so if those sorts of things are causing issue, they're present within the DNA of the church, and they have been for 2,000 years. So it sounds like maybe your critique should then be with Christianity as a whole. If you don't appreciate those sorts of things, or you think there's a problem, not with Christianity now. Are there problems in Christianity now? Yes. But that critique, I think, is very ahistorical, and it's also it confuses and creates confusion. It not only confuses some presuppositions, but then it sort of gives birth to more confusion as people sort of viralize it in TikTok and Instagram videos and things like that.
Well, I think one good example of that is the article, the New York Post article that we mentioned. So if you cut through some of the identitarian language in the article, basically they quote Father Josiah Trenum, who says the feminization of non-Orthodox forms of Christianity has been in high gear for decades. Our worship forms are very traditional and very masculine. And what he's basically getting at is that Orthodoxy is masculine because they place a high emphasis on asceticism. But again, there's nothing inherently masculine or feminine about asceticism. That's just being a Christian. There may be ways in which a male is, ascetically in a different form than a female, but there's still a calling on both to be ascetic. And many of our ascetical practices that characterize the lives of everyday Christians, like fasting, daily prayer, days of obligation, moral rigor, first of all, aren't exclusively Orthodox, nor are they inherently masculine.
Right.
I think what you see is there's a desire among some younger people, Gen Z and younger, where there's a kind of desire for a kind of tyranny, which is a mirror to a lack of virtue, right? Like they can sense that in themselves, and so they want someone to impose it on them. And so parts of Orthodoxy where there's a very authoritarian figure who tells them what to do can be very appealing. But I think that's a really artificial view of spiritual development, because of course we should practice fasting, and of course we should have regular prayer, and of course we should do almsgiving and self-discipline, and we should have spiritual directors who walk with us as we go along the Christian journey. But that's a very mechanistic view that misses the point. Like, you could fast 200 days a year, you cannot use birth control, and you can still lack the beauty of holiness.
Right.
So it's not an asceticism versus femininity question, which is kind of how the article sets it up. You can be a rigorous Christian and be a male or female. There's nothing inherently masculine about rigor.
I think that's a huge point here, is we can't conflate a sort of rigorous, disciplined, devoted, ascetic expression of Christianity with masculinity or femininity, because, and I point this out in the article that I wrote about it, if we do that conflation, if we take what are sort of culturally conditioned understandings of what quote unquote masculinity is, the person who most perfectly embodies those categories is a woman.
Right.
So let's talk about bravery. Is bravery inherently masculine? If so, the bravest human being to live was Our Lady. Is, fidelity and rigor and strength, are these things inherently masculine? If so, find me a better example than the Blessed Virgin Mary. And so I think what we've done to make things easier, to make it more conducive to the sad state of kind of viral internet culture, what we've done is we've bleached away any sort of nuance. We've set things in boxes, and we've said, this is how we're defining X, and this is how we're defining Y. And I can gather a following. I can make very controversial, very viral, clickbait kind of videos, posts, whatever, based on these contexts, these categories that we've created for what masculinity and femininity is. And then I can use it as a springboard to criticize things I don't like.
Yep.
And it continues, it perpetuates this sense of divisive tribalism, this sort of in and out crowd. without actually getting to anything substantive. It's so vapid, it's so changing, it's so unrooted from the tradition that they say they're trying to embody. Because speaking of the Orthodox liturgy, and I'm just thinking of liturgy in general, but we can take specifically the Orthodox liturgy, or Roman Catholic, Anglican, whatever it is. One of the problems, and I try to just to get people to think differently, one of the things that I try to tell people is we don't take the Eucharist. We receive the Eucharist. It is offered on our behalf. And so we receive the gift that God has given us. I don't initiate that gift. I don't, reach out and grab it. I'm not the active party here. I'm sort of actively passive, if that makes sense. I'm participating and engaging in this gift giving. I'm the recipient of this gift. And if you look at the Orthodox liturgy and you want to talk about a quote unquote masculine liturgy, the liturgy is sort of the drama of God doing something on our behalf and us receiving it in thankfulness, Eucharist, to give thanks. I am being transformed. I am being given new life. The liturgy is visually so representative of that. So I'm confused at how we would define that as being more masculine than, say, the Anglican or the Roman Catholic liturgy, when they're all doing the same thing. The same liturgical principle applies.
Let's talk about that a little bit, actually, if that's okay. I think, in fact, let's get philosophical for a moment.
Always.
Yeah, always. We have talked before extensively, perhaps maybe more early on in the show's history, but about nominalism. And I think the three of us together might be some of the three most anti-nominalist people you will ever meet. Not a philosophy that we're fond of really in any way. So the nominalists would say, look, categories are just names. There is no metaphysical entity to which they correspond. They are just words that we as humans use to sort of situate ourselves in a hectic and chaotic world. So there is no such thing as houses. There are just buildings that we kind of group together and call houses. And of course, we'd say there's no real category called buildings. They're just structures that we group together and call buildings. And then they'd say there's no real structures because there's no real category of structure. There are just these things, so you keep kind of kicking the can down the road, metaphysically speaking, right? That's bad. Nominalism's bad. This exists sometimes when we talk about gender. I've heard it said that a lot of sort of modern, queer theory and gender ideology will say, gender's like the spoon in the matrix. There is no spoon. There's no gender, really. It's just whatever you want it to be. And so, these are just labels that we use. And they add a sort of further dimension to that, which is these are labels we use to oppress people. Okay, so that's the nominalist account of gender. But there is, I think, one other camp which we have not given great attention to in the past, which is a kind of essentialism, which is sort of the opposite end of the spectrum as nominalism. And essentialism wants to sort of try to remove any variation of a thing. It wants to make everything kind of artificially the same. So an essentialist wouldn't just say that houses are buildings in which humans live. They would say houses are buildings made of brick in which humans live, or whatever aspect of houses they. But of course, a real definition of house can include things like a log cabin. It can include a brick mansion. It can include an apartment, right? And so the essentialist goes too far in this. And I think what we're pushing back on is that there are a lot of people in the church who, in reacting to sort of nominalist accounts of gender through critical scholarship and queer theory, want to proffer a kind of account of gender that is essentialist. They want to say masculinity is whatever sort of cultural things we've decided belong to masculinity, colors, certain activity, hunting, shooting guns, inherently masculine. And other things are inherently feminine, doing the dishes, making a sandwich, which of course is not true, but these are what people essentialize as that's what it means to be masculine, that's what it means to be feminine. And I think that's profoundly unhelpful, and in some ways the other side of the coin from the nominalist account, right? So I remember early on in our marriage, we were listening to NPR on the way to church, back when my wife and I went to church at the same time. I hardly remember those days, but the story was about parents of transgender children, and many of the parents of transgender children on the interview were saying, well, we knew that Johnny was actually a boy and not a girl when he wanted to play soccer instead of have tea parties. Or we knew that that Charlie was really a girl and not a boy when she wanted to play dress up instead of football. It's like, well, that isn't, you're not really talking about actual masculinity and femininity. You're talking about cultural expressions of masculinity and femininity that are accidental, not essential. But they're committing the same sort of problem.
Yeah, I was, this came up in a conversation I was having just a few days ago. And I brought up a relatively famous individual from history, Beau Brummel. If you've ever seen, heard of, or worn a bow tie, you will have engaged in a piece of, fashion or clothing that was begun by Beau Brummel. He reacted against the sort of foppish trends in male fashion, and sort of gives us the typical sort of Jane Austen dandy with the short jackets to increase the broadness of one's shoulders, and the more muted color patterns and all these sorts of things. Very masculine, quote unquote, for the day. However, people would pay to watch him dress in the morning for hours. It took him hours to get ready.
Listeners, if you'd like to watch us get dressed in the morning, you can join the community of Patreon Saints for only $5 a month. Nobody wants. Actually, you have to pay us. So
we just lost subscribers just now.
No one wants that. No one wants that.
Everyone has jumped the ship now.
But men were so interested in fashion and style and his self-grooming routine that they wanted to be firsthand witnesses to how he did his hair and the care that he took to clean his nails and to get dressed and to put his shoes on and do all these different things. If you proffered that as a definition of masculinity today, people would probably, for the most part, say, oh my gosh, that's so not masculine.
Right.
But it's because of that sort of essentialist move where we've seen again, it's kind of type of nominalism, right? It's saying we're going to take these culturally conditioned definition of what we think masculinity should be, and we're going to tack it on as if it is absolutely essential and necessary to the thing. And so we've confused, again, sort of accidents and incidents. We've said something that is sort of accidentally, not in a whoopsie kind of sense, but in an outward appearance sort of sense, essential to X, is the only option. And it just doesn't account for history. It doesn't account for the complexities of human life. And it doesn't account for the fact that in some cases, things like opinion, preference are important. One of my best friends in high school and today, she loves Falcons football. I'm not all that interested in football, but she is, she could tell you starting roster. She sold out diehard fan, loves football and loves the Falcons. Does that mean that she's somehow less feminine because she likes football? No. But we've essentialized our sort of definition of masculinity to the point that if somebody just has a preference for a thing that's outside of that definition, then now she's sort of not feminine, or she is feminine, or he isn't masculine, or he is masculine.
And it seems like this sort of dyad that gets created between the nominalist and the essentialist reaction to it is reflected in how we talk about gender relations too, because we could talk about the genders of themselves, right, and what belongs in the box we call masculine or feminine or male, female, boy, girl, all these things. And we can get fussy about, where precisely like biological sex begins and ends versus gender begins and ends. And there's lots of ink spilled on that. But, as we get into the relations question, this whole problem is also reflected there, where we're offered two options, unsurprisingly, right? One of two camps that we can inhabit. One being the complementarian camp, the other one being the egalitarian camp, right? And it avoids both the nuances that experience brings forth, but also it has to ignore at some point alternatives to that dyad that get brought forward too. Take, for instance, in this case, right? I encountered this idea through reading an article from Notre Dame by Abigail Favale, and then traced it back to her source material, which was Sister Prudence Allen's, kind of magisterial tome, The Concept of Woman. But she brings forward, again, a favorite of ours, Hildegard of Bingen, who brings forth this like alternative to this either or that we've been presented with, which is, she talks about like non-polarized complementarity, right? Which perfectly acknowledges that, male and female are ontologically, they're equivalent, they have equivalent dignity. And also they're asymmetrically, they're functionally asymmetrical, but also beyond that, which is where a lot of the either or camp stops. She says really provocatively that male and female are works of one another. And this is where we really make headway, and what I think actually helps us to see more clearly really the beauty of the Catholic Orthodox tradition, which is that it acknowledges that without that being the kind of stated, the stated propositional belief of either, is that we acknowledge that yes, there is something to which we're called to have the mind of Christ. We're called to be the body of Christ, right? There's a Christological character to the Christian life, of course, but that, like we've said before in this episode, that there's a Mariological character through which we enter into that, by which we inhabit that. And that, brings along what Prudence Allen, what Abigail Favale, what Hildegard are trying to teach us, which is that, yeah, male and female are works of are the works of each other, right? Eve is drawn from the side of Adam, but then Christ comes, Christ's humanity is a gift from Eve, from the new Eve, Mary, right? And there's this, it calls us to not, again, sever things that have this symbiosis to them, that they have to be understood together in simultaneity in order to be understood at all. And that's a harder thing to do. And it requires more patience. And ultimately, it forces us to acknowledge, with St. Paul in Ephesians 5, that, ultimately, whatever these things mean, male, female, they're cast in terms of brideliness and groomliness. And those things have a fulfillment that we haven't seen yet, because they're awaiting the consummation of the kingdom and the resurrection. And so putting all those pieces together, it brings us back to this conversation to say, we're usually presumptuously overstating what we know about these things, and then forming ideological positions around them. And that's a bummer, because then it forbids us, lest we be seen as traitors to our ideology. It forbids us from actually exploring what we know is there, right? What we all experience and intuitively know is there, which is there's something that only comes out of us when we're in the presence of the other, and likewise with them and us. And so, one of the things that I see, even the Catholic and Orthodox falling into is, even though they have the instrument of, the liturgy, the tradition, the scriptures at hand to recognize this, us being works of one another, the masculine and feminine, they capitulate that too often in order to be a champion of one of those more kind of what, frankly, I consider boring versions of a thing that is more complex and is more paradoxical, sure, and harder to get our arms around, but it's probably more truthful.
So maybe, just maybe, masculinity is more than liking sports and wanting to go shoot guns.
Yep.
Though you would never conclude that from visiting an evangelical men's conference, where hypermasculinity is what is on offer, by the way, contra to the fitness influencer.
Yeah.
But also, maybe the answer to our cultural confusion about masculinity isn't to over-define it in an essentialist way.
Yeah.
That makes a caricature of it. Maybe contrary to our agnostic athlete friends' chagrin, the church shouldn't bow to cultural fads of masculinity, whether they originate from the far left or the far right. And perhaps we should start broadening our understandings of masculinity and femininity rather than limiting them or boxing them in too narrowly.
Yeah, I think you have to, they have to, again, this is part of, I think, what we're called into as the fellowship of Christ's body is that there is something that is only revealed in the presence of the other. And that is just that, that's part of the revelatory apocalyptic quality of the church. I recall, I remember this really striking line. I think I first read it when I was reading C.S. Lewis's essay on chivalry, but he quotes this passage from Sir Thomas Malory's La Mort d'Arthur, The Death of Arthur, specifically the scene where they have Lancelot's funeral. And he says this really striking line in it. We're talking Lancelot, who is regarded in that whole saga as the greatest knight, right? The greatest, sort of terrestrial or worldly knight. And he says, and part of the eulogy given for him was, "Thou wert the meekest man and the gentlest that ever ate in hall among ladies, and thou wert the sternest knight to thy mortal foe that ever put spear in the rest." And Lewis points out, this isn't the either or of it. Lancelot is an interesting character because he is both of these things to the nth degree. And so he uses that as the basis for an idea of chivalry, which isn't a kind of 50-50 composite compromise between, the sternness and the to thy mortal foe on the one hand, and the meekness one has at table with ladies. But rather he is equally both of those things to an unimaginable extent, while being one person. And that's a fascinating kind of take on it. I don't hear anyone saying things like that now.
Yeah, no, I think you're right.
It gets to the point that it's easier to caricature and to oversimplify than it is to think deeply, deal with the paradox, but also deal with the complexities of human nature. We as human beings are complex things. And so oftentimes when we oversimplify in our lives, when we oversimplify for ideological, political, social reasons, it's because we don't want to deal with the complexities present to us. We don't want to deal with the complexities of ourselves, in ourselves, but we also then struggle with how we are relating to the world around us, otherness. And so we don't want to see ourselves in the other person because it brings to light things in ourselves we don't want to deal with. And so that lack of nuance and complexity it results in problems, but it can stir up a base.
That's exactly right. And I want to respond to your first point there, because I think it's really good, is that pastorally, and again, I'll caveat this with just saying it's limited to my experience. I don't have a broader basis for that. But in my pastoral experience, I've yet to meet the person that was really gung-ho about a hyper masculinity or a hyper femininity that wasn't hiding from some significant part of themselves, to a case. I've yet to find that person. And the more generally healthy a person's interior life becomes, I've found, the less this is a thing for them.
Yeah. I've had the same experience.
Yeah.
And I think it's something that we deal with pastorally when, we're sort of dealing with people what I always say is that the pastor deals with people bare, right?
Yeah.
There's this sort of open, stripped away encounter that the pastor has with the flock.
Yeah.
And it helps us understand ourselves. Again, it's the otherness aspect. We understand who we are in relation to the other
Right.
understands themselves in relationship to us. And so I have noticed that we are, generally speaking, culturally moving away from deep, thoughtful, complex conversations.
Yes.
And we are more quickly sort of falling into simple sort of binaries. And the only thing that hurts is ourselves.
Yeah. I'll also add that this is true of not just the masculine, feminine kind of dyad, but also the rational, emotive dyad too. That, you know, if someone comes in being like, I was drawn here because like I hate all the talk about feelings. And I'm like, oh boy, you're going to be disappointed eventually because we do a lot of that too, you know, and but that doesn't come at the expense of thinking deeply. And, you know, that's why I'm not really worried about, you know, I'm moderately concerned, but not really like deeply concerned about this language of people flocking in droves, you know, to orthodoxy because of its masculine, you know, it's freedom to be as masculine as you want to be. Because if you're really doing orthodoxy, you don't have the freedom to be as masculine as you want to be. If it turns into an imbalanced and extreme form of it. There is going to be a time where the asceticism, where like the just the devotional piety of orthodoxy or Catholicism does this thing where it says, okay, yeah, like the good that you're perceiving can be something that draws you into the fullness. But the closer you approach that fullness, it's going to also require of you and oblige from you attentiveness to those other things you may be neglecting to their atrophy. Like it won't let you stay like this lopsided kind of creature. Like eventually, like people that come to, you know, Anglicanism for the Book of Common Prayer saying, I got so sick of all the extemporaneous, you know, prayers out there. I'm like, well, let me introduce you to, you know, the part of the tripod of common prayer, which is personal prayer. And we're going to get you reacclimated to that, you know, and rehabilitate that. But it's going to be, you know, more stable because of its relation to the other things. And so, you know, sure, and a desire to be masculine may draw you toward a tradition, but if tradition is worth its salt, it's going to eventually elicit those other things and pull them out of you as well.
Yeah, we've talked too about the sort of listlessness that many experience in the sort of church shopping kind of mode, and we've talked about this sort of lack of willingness to commit. And so I personally see this particular move as part and parcel to the other moves that we've seen in people sort of drifting from one tradition to another. They're looking for something and they say, oh, well, you know, X church is a quote unquote masculine church, therefore I'm going to go there. But as you said, when they encounter the fullness of that tradition and it elicits emotive response or their discipline, their devotional life is then couched in feminine terms or something like that, they're going to have to reckon with it. And I don't think that necessarily they're going to stay there. My concern would be that they say, ooh, instead of dealing with the thing and adjusting to it and submitting to the rule of faith, that they pull back and say, oh, I'm now uncomfortable because of this quote unquote feminine thing I'm encountering. I'm out.
Yeah. When we make church an identity based thing, where we cater to one identity or another or whatever, it really, all we're doing is we're treating people as consumers, right? And when you treat people as consumers, they will leave as soon as you stop giving them the thing that they wanted. And so I think that's exactly right. I think, you know, what we need is to be able to test the fruit of this 10, 15, 20 years down the road. Are these people not only still Orthodox or still whatever, denomination they convert to as a solution to this, and are they growing in holiness? And if the answer to either of those things is no, then I think we bet on the wrong horse, and so, yeah, it's we shouldn't sell out to lesser projects as the church. If you want to hang out with cool guys, go find a nice dive bar with pool tables or something or whatever. I go join a football league, or there's a lot of ways to get plugged into, to meeting other guys. If you want to, as a lady, if you want to meet other ladies, there are lots of ways that you could do that. But the church is not about catering to those identity, sort of consumerist identity categories. That's just not our job. And if we focus on that, it really distracts from our mission.
Yeah, that's right. And it forsakes, it forsakes the very shape of the gospel. Again, like there's a potential, Marvel multiverse version of the gospel where, rather than being born of the Virgin Mary, the Lord comes down among us as in Zeus-like fashion, right? Where it's just like, behold, mortals, I am the Son of God. Full formed, fully manly, bearded and all, oddly wearing, Celtic war paint and, as well. But, that's not the gospel. Again, there's the man, right? The new Adam, and the new Eve are works of one another, right? So much so that, I remember this powerful line in Dante's Purgatory, right, where they address Mary as the daughter of her son, right? And it reveals this kind of, again, that male and female, masculine, feminine, these things, they require one another, and they also elicit a sort of mirror of that in one another too, right? We quoted, we talked about Lancelot from Malory and this idea of Christian chivalry. But then on the other hand, you take like Joan, St. Joan of Arc, for example, right? And it's like, I have the Lord my God. I am not afraid of the soldiers that await my path to the Dauphin, right? Like I was born to do this, and there's this thing that's elicited from her, and it doesn't require her to, like so many modern, churches, like historians would say, oh, well, she was, she must have been, this or that identity, because she was, evincing these sort of masculine traits. And it's like, no, that's all of that is kind of sexist, right? Because it's kind of saying like these two, either sex is completely incapable of having a range beyond this very narrow, caricature. Which seems to be so chauvinistic, so sexist, no matter which side you're doing it from or which side you're doing it to. Like, again, it misses that fullness of the person.
100%.
Well, it's probably about time we start landing this plane a little bit, but maybe I'll offer a brief concluding summary, I think, of what we've said. And if you want to amend it at all, feel free. But I think we should conclude that the goal of every Christian, regardless of their gender or their vocation or their station of life, is to incarnate a sort of upside down ethic of the crucified Lord. And so all Christian living, whether you're a man or a woman, should be characterized by self-donation to the other. Mm-hmm. But we can only do that self-donation when we receive the grace that God gives us in the sacraments, which is a sort of inherently feminine posture. We might express those gifts in our own ways as men and women. We may be called to be husbands or wives. We might be called to be fathers or mothers or brothers or sisters or sons or daughters. But we're always, but those are always variations on a theme rather than their own things. A man is called to embody that sacrificial ethic in his particular context, in his particular ways, and a woman is called to do the same thing, but there is no understanding of masculinity or femininity that can be separated from cruciformity, at least that would be acceptable for us as Christians.
Right.
And so what we want is a realist view of these things, what masculinity and femininity really are. We don't want the nominalist account that says they're not real, and we don't want the essentialist account that kind of makes them hyper specific. Which means we have to make room for some mystery. We have to make those boxes a little bigger, and that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing.
And I'd like to just put a little bit of a finer point there on that point, which is we're also as I think as Christians, we're called to a moderate realism too, which again avoids the essentialist error, but that it also acknowledges that again what we are, what we shall be has not yet been revealed, right? And that's continuous with what we are now, and so. It calls us away from a kind of self-enclosing realism that's like, okay, things are what they are, without dipping into the essentialism. It lets us to have the freedom to say, yeah, there's a kind of unfolding mystery of what we are, and that we have not been shown, in full form what we will be, and so we have to hold that kind of open-ended.
Yes. Excellent. Well, I think we've figured out gender, at least as far as we can. So
the
that's good.
Sacramentalists solve gender.
Sacramentalists solve gender. That's right. Very good. Well, as always, it's a pleasure to end our episodes with just a brief reprieve from the more serious and tedious by talking about what we're into. Father Hayden, what are you into these days?
Yeah. Let's see. So I've become utterly indifferent to football because of just all this, the repeated tragedy of being the Cowboys fan along with you, Father Walker. It's so that's being set far behind me. Mainly, what we've been doing is my son and I have been building this elaborate Hot Wheels track together and racing cars along it. That's been a lot of fun and occupying a lot of free time. And then also we're starting to plot the kind of the spring garden and kind of get things arranged for when it becomes the right time to do that. So I'm really excited to be getting back in the yard in the next month or two, and so we're starting to lay down plans for what we want to do for the spring and summer garden, and that's been fun too.
Excellent. Father Creighton, what are you into?
Well, since we are recording this on the feast of King Charles the Martyr, that also means I am engaging in my sort of yearly habit of watching a particular film, which I recommend to everyone, which is called Cromwell. And it has Alec Guinness as King Charles the Martyr. And it's an interesting film, but it also, I think, has a pretty interesting depiction of King Charles the Martyr. And so I've been, I watch it every year just because I like the movie. I think I watched it the first time when I was a kid, my dad. And he made a comment. I can't remember the exact wording of it. But he was like, "Ooh, isn't Cromwell gross?" And I was just like, I'm getting those vibes.
Raise up your children in the way they should go.
Yeah. I was like, oh, okay, cool. But yeah, so King Charles the Martyr, Cromwell, it's a great plug for a film. So if you're interested in that time period and you want a well-made movie, that's a great option.
Cromwell is one of my least favorite nominalists.
That's right. He comes from a long line of destructive nominalists, including Martin Luther. And anyways, that's a whole other. So mine is much more mundane. It is foosball. For Christmas, we got the boys a foosball table from a teacher. Our boys. Yeah, exactly. So we got them this foosball table, but it was like a mini one, and it was a teacher at my oldest son's school who was getting rid of it, and so we got it from her, and so we put that up. We played a lot over Christmas break, and really enjoyed it. And then the table got kind of wobbly and it was really small. And when we moved, the leg broke off. So we ordered a really nice, like, bigger table that we're now playing on. So the first one only had 3 per side, 3 bars per side, but now there are 4 per side, and it's much larger. It's super fun. I will say on the new table, I'm undefeated. Though when I was setting it up, I accidentally put the bars in backwards. So it was like if you were a lefty, it would have been really good, but it was terrible. So I had to unscrew each little piece that had to go on the bars and flip them all around. It was terribly tedious. But anyways, foosball is very fun, and our youngest son is so into it. I beat him earlier, and he was like, "Well, we have to play again." And if I did that and I beat him again, he'd say, "Well, we have to play again." He'd keep me there all day if I'd let him. So, anyways, yeah, foosball, a super fun activity, especially as a family. We have little tournaments and stuff. So
That's awesome.
excellent. Well, listeners, we appreciate you coming on this journey with us and having conversation with us. If you want to continue that conversation, feel free to find us on X, as it's now called, or Facebook. You can also email us at thesacramentalists@gmail.com. And if you want to continue the conversation even more in depth than you probably ever wanted to, you can join our communion of Patreon Saints for just $5 a month and become a member of our Discord community, where we have recently started praying the daily office pretty regularly. And so that's been a good time. We have a good turnout for that. And yeah, it's nice to know there are other people praying the office at the same time. So anyways, Father Hayden, would you close us with a blessing?
Certainly. Let us pray. The peace of God, which passeth all understanding, keep your hearts and minds in the knowledge and love of God and of his Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost be upon you this day and remain with you always. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.